Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I live here in Austin, Texas. Have had the gift of recovery for the past 50 years, and extremely grateful for that. Hoping for another 50, but we'll see how that turns out. The purpose of these podcasts is to try to go deeper into the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, the recovery program, to look at it psychologically, spiritually, and historically. So come at it from a bunch of different angles. Idea being that that it's a lot deeper. I guess that's what I want to say. It's a lot deeper than just slogans and meetings and things of that nature. It's really a transformation of one's life. And I just want to give people the information that may help facilitate that transformation at a deeper level. I hope you will visit our website. It's called Two-Way Prayer. And we did a video there several months back, put it up on the front page. It'll teach you a form of prayer that they did in the Oxford group and in the early days of AA. There's also a set of handouts there that will help you do the practice and learn a little bit more about it. While you're on the website, please make sure you sign up for our newsletter. If these podcasts are helpful for you, hit the like button and do whatever the heck you're supposed to do to make these things more popular. But my guidance has been to get this information out to as many people in 12-step recovery as I possibly can. So if you're able to help me in doing that, I would be deeply appreciative, as I am for the folks who have made donations to support this work and keep it going. If you'd like to drop me a line, you can reach me at Two-Way Prayer, TWO, twowayprayer@gmail.com. We are getting close to the end now of a very short series. It's called The Book. I've decided to try to write a book. Got about, 50, 60 pages done so far. It had started off to be a booklet, but it's turning out that it's going to be a little bit more in-depth than that. The booklet, or the book, is on two-way prayer. Did the video. What I really believe, and am finding out to be true, is that by doing a book, I can go a lot deeper and give you some more background information on the practice. So that's the idea behind it. Hope to have it maybe ready by the spring of next year, 2024. In the last episode, we addressed a set of suggestions for how to do the two-way prayer practice. And what I want to do in this particular episode is focus on the four absolutes. And just a little bit of word of warning, I haven't finished writing this chapter for the book, so I am going to be winging it here a little bit. But I felt it was really important to couple this with last week's episode on how to do the practice, because two-way prayer and the four absolutes are combined. They're really part of a package deal. And if you only get half the package, I think you're going to be missing the message. So that message was brought home to me a number of years ago through a fellow by the name of James Houck. And James was in the Oxford group. He was a member of the Oxford group. He got sober actually the day after Bill Wilson got sober back in 1934. And Wally P., who was an archivist, AA archivist in Tucson, Arizona, he and James were traveling around the country. He kind of discovered James and found out that he was doing a form of two-way prayer, had been doing it for years, and Wally was interested in that. So they would come to Austin, and every time they'd come, I'd be sure to show up at a little workshop that they'd do, figuring that James was pushing 100 at that point, and I didn't figure he'd be back anytime soon. So, but he'd always show up again next year. Long story short, I went to visit James at his home in Maryland a number of years ago. Interested in two-way prayer, knew that he had been doing it all of his adult life, and wanted to get some tips on how to do it better. And I think I was looking for some gimmicks, to be really honest about it. And what he told me in our conversation wasn't the only thing he said, but the most important thing, the takeaway that I got from our meeting was he said, Bill, two-way prayer is all about the four absolutes. And I didn't recognize the depth of that truth probably for many years afterwards. But I think he was absolutely right. The prayer practice has to be grounded in the four absolutes, because that was the bedrock of what the Oxford group was about. And they were an important part of what Pioneer AA was all about. So that's what we're going to dig into here. So we'll start with a little bit of history. The Four Absolutes first appeared in the work of a man by the name of Robert E. Speer, S-P-E-E-R. And Speer was a Presbyterian missionary. He was also a scholar, and he wrote a book on the life of Jesus. It was called The Principles of Jesus. It came out in 1902. And what Speer concluded in that book was that the life of Jesus reflected what he called a set of absolute moral standards, standards that could serve to guide our thoughts, our decisions, and our actions. And Speer called them moral guidelines, grouped them under four headings, and those were honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. He said, if you want to know who Jesus was, he was a man who was honest, pure, unselfish, and loving. And he was absolutely so. That's where Speer was coming from. And Frank Bookman, the founder of the Oxford Group, he was trying to simplify the Christian message and change people radically, as he was changed, as Wilson was changed, through a psychic change. And that's going to really be the subject of next week's podcast episode. But Frank Bookman liked these because they were simple, they were easy, and they were profound. They really got to some great depth in a person. Now, you might pick four other ones, four other moral standards that you're going to try to live by. And if you're really trying to live by them, they're going to impact your life profoundly. I haven't found any better ones than these four, although at the end of the podcast, I think I am going to try to add a fifth one, because I think it might be important. At least it has been for me. Again, the Oxford Group people had no steps, but the four absolutes were the central part of their program. And they never made it over into AA for a number of reasons. They never made it into the big book. First of all, the reason for that was Bill Wilson didn't like them so much. He thought they were too much for an alcoholic to handle, particularly in the beginning when he or she was just starting off in recovery. To hit him with these absolute standards was going to be too much for them to bear. His expression was, don't try to get too damned good by Thursday. Kind of like that. But Dr. Bob felt otherwise. You know, Bob's participation in the Oxford Group, and he was active in the group 2 years before Wilson ever even showed up in Akron. He wasn't staying sober, but he was a member of the group. And he was a great proponent of the four absolutes. And, you know, if you will go to Akron and Cleveland today, you'll probably see them hanging on some of the walls in the AA meetings. If you go to Dr. Bob's gravesite, where he and his wife Ann are buried, you're going to see the four absolutes right next to them, chiseled in stone. So he was a believer in the absolutes where Wilson was not. And I guess if Dr. Bob had written the big book, they'd be in there, and they'd be in there in a strong way. In 1948, just shortly before his own death, this is what Bob said at his last major AA talk. He said, the four absolutes, as we called them, were the only yardsticks we had in the early days before the steps. I think the absolutes still hold good and can be extremely helpful. I have found at times that a question arises, and I want to do the right thing, but the answer is not obvious. Almost always, if I measure my decision carefully by the yardsticks of absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity, and absolute love. And if it checks up pretty well with these four, then my answer can't be very far out of the way. Now, it's interesting. The four absolutes are really, they're not there to help us with what's the difference between right and wrong. They're there to help us with which way do I go when I'm confronted by two things that are right. Do I go this way? Do I go that way? And that's extremely important in applying them to your two-way prayer. It's not just is it right or wrong. It's deeper than that. Is this where God is guiding me? Is this the most honest thing to do, the most loving thing to do, or is it less than that? And interestingly, when Bill Wilson was asked, since the absolutes were such an important part of the Oxford Group program, and since he was trying to take the program and put it into a number of steps, he was asked once, where did you put them in your 12 steps? And he said, I put them in steps 6 and 7. And I stumbled across that in a footnote, I think it was, in Ernest Kurtz's book, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous, page 242 for the obsessive compulsives out there. But that was an important clue for me, and it really changed profoundly my understanding of those two steps. They took on a new life to them. And not only were they really part of 6 and 7, they were also a part of the 4th and 5th step that people would do. Let me, before I get to that, let me do one thing. I want to talk about the step itself, step 6 in particular, okay? We're entirely, because I want you to get a feel for this thing, and we're going to take it out and examine it in some greater depth. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Steps 6 and 7 are the shortest steps you find in the big book. Each one gets a paragraph. Wilson doesn't say a heck of a lot of them. And I think he was trying to kind of tuck them away. He did not want Alcoholics Anonymous to be associated with the Oxford Group. And the four absolutes were extremely present in the mind of the public. They were associated with the Oxford Group. So that could be one reason for kind of obscuring them, covering them over in some way, and yet trying to get the truth and the importance of them into the steps. So we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And two words jump out at me: entirely and all. And even though he may not have liked absolute, you're coming pretty close to absolute when you're talking about entirely and you're talking about all. He didn't say we were somewhat ready, we were kind of ready to have God remove some of these defects of character. It's not what the step says. So in that sense, he was true to what the Oxford Group program was trying to convey. That I need to bring my ego into alignment with the God of my understanding, not as a pinch hitter to come in and help me when I'm in trouble, but to have a transformation of the self at the very deepest level. And that's what we're going to get into a kind of heavy way next week. What is the transformation process that happens to a self through the steps? You see? Well, gets humble, becomes obedient. It comes into alignment with a power greater than its self. That's the deal. He didn't write much in the big book, but I think if you will look at the 12 and 12 on step 6, you're going to see the importance of these steps, and particularly step 6, and you're going to maybe see it more as it was understood in the early days. So Wilson writes, although Tom Powers, I'm going to mention Tom Powers a little later in this episode, but Tom Powers helped Bill Wilson write the 12 and 12. And Wilson was his sponsor. He came into the program in the 1940s in New York. He helped him write the 12 and 12. He helped Wilson write AA Comes of Age. He helped edit the second edition of the Big Book. And he and Wilson were extremely close. And Tom started his own fellowship. He wanted a more pure, let us say, a more faithful Oxford group component to the steps than Wilson and AA. They were kind of covering up a lot of this stuff. He took the four absolutes and he put them into his program. So if you go to a meeting of all Addicts Anonymous today, they're not very large, but they are very insightful in terms of conveying the original meaning of the program. That's what they're kind of focused on. What was the original program before it got watered down? And that's always been a concern of mine, that we reduce the program of transformation to a bunch of slogans, and we go to meetings, and it gets kind of shallow. But if you really dive into the deep end of the pool, you're going to find some very heavy stuff going on here. So let's just go over this couple of paragraphs here from the 12 and 12 on step 6, because the concern is about perfection. That's always the objection. You know, what I constantly hear anytime you mention the four absolutes is, well, it's about progress and not perfection. We aim for progress. And I don't think that's true. I think we aim for perfection and we settle for progress, because we're not going to achieve perfection. But if we just aim for progress, I got a little better today, didn't kill anybody. I must be doing good. Didn't drink anything. Maybe I did all sorts of other things. No, the aim is for perfection. All right? The trick is to settle for progress. That's absolutely key. So listen to what Wilson says in the 12 and 12. Many will ask, how can we accept the entire implication of step 6? Why, that is perfection. This sounds like a hard question, but practically speaking, it isn't. Only step 1, where we made the 100% admission we were powerless over alcohol, can be practiced with absolute perfection. That's something that was drilled into me in the early days. You can get 100% of I'm powerless over alcohol. You can recognize that 100%. Even the second half of step 1, and then the rest of the steps, you're not going to get them completely. How unmanageable is my life? My ego is going to step in constantly and say, it ain't unmanageable at all. Watch me, I'll manage it. See? So the depth of that reaches down even into the unconscious level, the depth of it, you're not going to realize it. But you better come as close as you can. You better shoot for realizing it as best you can. So only step 1, where we made 100% admission where we were powerless over alcohol, can be practiced with absolute perfection. The remaining 11 steps state perfect ideals. They are goals towards which we look and the measuring sticks by which we estimate our progress. Analogy I make for this is if I'm piloting an airplane, which I thank God I've never done, but if I were, I would head for due north. And pilots tell me this is exactly what they do. They set their little instrument on due north, and that's the direction in which they head. Not kind of north, sort of north, half-assed north, not south, due north. And then they drift, and then they correct. And then they drift, and then they correct. And that's how they're going to wind up going north. Head it for perfection, settle for progress. Bill goes on, says, seen in this light, step 6 is still difficult, but not at all impossible. The only urgent thing is that we make a beginning and keep trying. If we would gain any advantage in the use of this step on problems other than alcohol, we shall need to make a brand new venture in open-mindedness. We shall need to raise our eyes toward perfection and be ready to walk in that direction. It will seldom matter how haltingly we walk. The only question will be, are we ready? Head for perfection, settle for progress. And you do that each morning in your two-way prayer. You aim for doing God's will, praying only for the knowledge of his will for us, and then for the power to carry that out. You keep your eye on that. Before the big book, they used the 4 absolutes in what we would call the 4th and 5th step. They would, a new person coming in would be given 4 sheets of paper, and 1 absolute would be written on the top of each piece of paper. And then they'd be asked to, ask God to show you where you're missing the mark, where you're blocking him in this area of your life. Then they would listen, and they would write, and then they would share. It turns into steps 4 and 5. Here's Sam Shoemaker, who Wilson credits with giving him steps 2 through 11. It's a quote from Shoemaker. He said, "It would be a very good thing if you took a piece of paper and wrote down the sins you feel guilty of." Now, there's another example. They never use the word sin in the big book that I'm aware of. It might be in there somewhere. But this is what they meant by character defects. It's kind of covering them over. We don't want to scare those alcoholics off. All right. So make a list of the sin, and sin just means what? Missing the mark. Make a list of all the places where we missed the mark in our lives, or that you feel guilty about. Write these things down. One of the simplest rules for self-examination that I know, this is Shoemaker, is to use the use of the 4 standards, which Dr. Robert E. Spears said represented the summary of the Sermon on the Mount. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. Review your life in their light. Put down everything that doesn't measure up. Be realistically honest. Now, we've got the 3 or 4 columns in the big book, and I found that very confusing, to be honest. I had to make a real serious outline. That's the way I did it, because I didn't know about any of this stuff. But I have used this as an experiment with a number of people who had never done a 4th step, and we just tried a real simple thing. Take this sheet of paper, write honest, pure, unselfish, and loving on one on each sheet. And then ask God to show you, where have you screwed up in this area? Worked out pretty well. It's not a checklist, then it's not a mechanical thing. And that's one of the things that for some reason, I'm just not very conducive to a mechanical kind of AA. I think it's an in-depth program. And I think people need to go in depth and really find out what's going on beneath the surface of things. And I found this was very helpful for getting down to that bedrock level. Now, in Cleveland, they still, in AA central office, they still publish a pamphlet on the 4 absolutes. You can get it today. I'll try to put a link in the show notes for you. I don't think it's the greatest pamphlet in the world. Dr. Bob approved it. They published a number of little pamphlets in the Cleveland, Akron area. It wasn't the greatest writing in the world, but it does give you a glimpse into what that program was focused on back in those days. So just highlights from the pamphlet: honesty, is it true or is it false? Purity, is it right or is it wrong? Unselfishness, how will this affect the other fella? Love, Is it ugly or is it beautiful? So, how better to understand the four absolutes? And this is where I found Tom Powers to be of some help to me with all of this. Again, he used them in his All Addicts Anonymous program, and he saw the importance of them. That if you blend these with the 12 steps, you come up with a more solid package for recovery. I'll take a look at Tom's contributions here, and we'll go through the steps. Oh, excuse me, the absolutes, the standards. I did an interview a couple of months ago with a woman who was 50 years doing two-way prayer in the Oxford group. She'd never come into AA. She wasn't an alcoholic. And I said, the four absolutes, oh, you mean the four guidelines? Well, that's an even gentler way to approach it, isn't it? Four guidelines for living. That's what we're talking about here. Things towards which I want to move, I want these to become more of me. Honest, pure, unselfish, loving. So let's go through. Big book. Honesty gets a big play there, doesn't it? Rigorous honesty. The results were nil, until we were rigorously honest about this stuff. Same thing with the steps. We had to be ruthlessly, rigorously honest. Well, that goes right back to the four standards. Tom Powers broke it down. I kind of like this. He said, no lying, no cheating. For those of us who like to wiggle out of stuff, no stealing. In a word, in all your affairs, simply and absolutely no falsehood. God, I mean, I've worked with people for many, many years, including working with myself, but there's just layers of falsehood that get peeled off in recovery and in life. If you're making progress, if you're moving forward, we're all liars. I'm sorry about that, but we are. And these lies, one by one, must be let go of. And they may not be, vicious lies or things like that, but they're not seeing myself as I am. The shadow gets in the way. The shadow obscures them, obfuscates them, denies them. We project them out onto other people. So, no falsehood. Purity. Now, if there's one word that sets people off, when I talk about the four absolutes, they always look at them and say, honesty, yeah, that's good. Unselfishness, sure. Love, who's against that? Purity, what the hell are you talking about here? Are you messing with my sex life? I mean, people instantly go right to that one. I understand that, and Wilson deals with that in the big book, when he's doing the inventory, they do the fear inventory, the anger inventory, the resentment, and they do a sex inventory. And that goes back to this, that it has to be looked at, because if there's anything that gets alcoholics and addicts into trouble after they put down the drugs, put down the alcohol, it's sexually what was going on. So it's a huge part of shame and guilt, and it needs to be brought into the sunlight. And I need to, like the big book says, approach it, realistically and honestly. And so if you just say purity, you think they're messing with your sex life. It goes deeper than that. And this is where I really like what Powers did with it. He breaks it down and he talks about purity of mind. What's going on in the deepest layers of our minds? Purity of body. How are we doing with food? How are we doing with smoking? How are we doing with other bodily addictions? How are we taking care of ourselves? Purity of body. Purity of the emotions. We can be tremendously rageful. Well, I didn't take a drink, didn't do any drugs today. But what's going on at the emotional level? Is that pure? Have you set a high standard towards which you're working towards that? Not that you're not going to fail, not that you're not going to screw up. We do. And maybe we do it daily. That's okay. But we're heading in the right direction. Purity of heart. And then he lists sexual purity. So this is more in the sense of contamination, which is really what impurities are about. So if I got a concoction, most of you guys are not old enough to remember Ivory Soap, but it used to be 99 and 100% pure. I guess there was a little, even Ivory Soap was contaminated. But the idea is to look for the contaminations in my life, to spot them, to acknowledge them, to bring God's light into them, and to move forward in overcoming them. That's where we're heading. It's not that we have to live up to it and I'm damned if I don't. That's nonsense. It's attracting me towards fuller growth. In 6 and 7, you identify them. But let me tell you, they're going to be with us for the rest of our life, many of them. And so they become the work of 10, 11, and 12. Again, Oxford Group had no steps. But this is where they're going to be worked on or worked at in our lives. Unselfishness. Well, Big Book is big on this one. Selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problems. One Oxford Group author, A.J. Russell, identified quite a few more, which I found was very interesting. This attraction to self. So it's not just selfishness, self-centeredness, self-importance, self-interest, self-pity, self-seeking, self-conscious, self-indulgence, self-sufficiency. Boy, this self is something else. And this self is indeed the root of our problems. But damn, does it go deep. Just looking at unselfishness at a very superficial level. Well, I shared this or I did that nice and wasn't that good of me. You're missing it. But to see how it has me trapped, that's the real work, and it's rewarding. It's not just trudging; it's rewarding. As I make room for something else to come in and take its place. Powers talked about unselfishness is seeking what is right and true ahead of what I want in every situation. The big I, what I want. What is right, what is true in this situation. And that's where prayer comes in. That's where two-way prayer comes in. That's where guidance comes in. That's why these absolutes, these standards, these guidelines are so wrapped up into the prayer life itself. So, because the Oxford Group thing, if you wanted to boil it down in a nutshell, it's moving from self-centeredness to God-centeredness. That the center, the internal center, the unconscious center, undergoes a shift from being rooted in self to rooted in God, or in Jungian terms, rooted in the greater self, rooted in the greater personality. Last one is love. Big Book does the opposite here, and then, it tells, watch for these things, and 3 out of 4 it names, but on love, it talks, I think, mostly about fear as the opposite of love. We're rooted in that. Because if you're rooted in self, you're going to be rooted in fear. because you're already playing God in some way, and you're afraid you're going to get found out. So at a deep unconscious level, you're frightened. Probably the greatest lesson I ever had on love was early in my program. I went to an AA meeting, and the topic was what's at the core of your problem, your alcohol problem. And went around the room. I've mentioned this before in some podcasts. But went around the room. People said different things, and I had a lousy self-image. I had a lousy childhood. I got a lousy marriage. That's what the problem. I had a lousy judge. And one woman said, "I have a love disorder." And I'm sitting in the back room. I was too afraid to talk in those days. But I heard her say that. "I have a love disorder. The root of my problem is a love disorder." And I said, "Damn, she's got it. She's got it. I'm afraid to love. I'm afraid to be loved. I'm afraid to allow anybody to love me." That's the blockage. So absolute love. Powers says, loving God with all your heart. I don't think this is an original. Loving God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. Loving your neighbor as yourself. Love and service are our code. You want to boil the thing down? It's love and service. And maybe the biggest thing is learning to love ourselves. And I think that's another place that two-way prayer is so helpful. When God is speaking to you and you're writing those words down, you're hearing absolute love coming through to you. And that was the standard by which they judged things. If what you're hearing is not honest, pure, unselfish, if it's not loving, throw it out. It cannot be from God. See? Are you starting to make the equation there? That for two-way prayer, for the writings, they are heading me towards becoming more honest, pure, unselfish, and loving. The writings themselves have to be imbued with honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love, or you're not in contact with God. So there's an equation there that is vital, and that's why I wanted to do this podcast at this stage. Hey, let's look briefly then at the absolutes, the four absolutes in two-way prayer, and here again, there were no steps. So when I talk about two-way prayer, what I'm really, really, really talking about is 10, 11, and 12. 10 is part of the prayer. I'm watching myself, or at least it's part of the prayer practice. I'm watching myself for where am I out of order with these four things. Was I honest yesterday? Was I selfish yesterday? Am I stuck in myself today? What's going on inside of me? Am I loving or am I afraid? What's the situation? Read it, feel it, sense it. And then out of that comes a question, a need for help. God, I feel blah, blah, blah. Yesterday I was blah, blah, blah. I've got this coming up and I'm scared to death. Please help me. That's 10 stuff. 11, you listen. And you listen to love. And you listen to honesty. And you listen to purity. And you listen to unselfishness. Because that's what's coming back. So 10, we watch. 11, we pray, listen, write. 12, we act. There's a flow to this thing. I'm going to receive guidance in my prayer practice now. It's not just I said a lot of nice words, isn't that lovely? And I read 5 meditations from different authors. Well, isn't that nice? No. In two-way prayer, you go deep inside. You see what's wrong. You see what's out of kilter. You see where you're not in alignment with the power that wants to change you, the power that wants to transform you, and will. So I go along with it, hey? And this is the action of step 12. And this is where I then begin to experience God, not just to talk about, not just a concept, but a lived reality. I'm in touch with a greater reality. The great reality is within. And the great reality has business with me, you see? You know, that this voice wants you and me to become who we are capable of becoming. If you want to put it into a short sentence, that's about as brief as I can get. And so this is the lesser self. We'll talk about this more next week. The lesser self and the greater self. And the greater self wants me to become who I can be. Think of yourself as an acorn. You can be satisfied just being an acorn. Most acorns who go to Acorns Anonymous weekly, they're frightened little acorns. I understand that. But there's something inside of them that says, no, buddy, you're an oak tree. And I want you to become an oak tree. But you got to let go of your acornness to make room for this to happen. If you're a caterpillar, I think this is the Al-Anon symbol. The caterpillar has to become a butterfly. But it's a frightened little caterpillar, What the hell is going to be? I was born a caterpillar. I grew up with caterpillar. I don't know a damn thing about flying. But it's going to push you and it's going to pull you. And this is the greater self at work within our minds. And this is what we have to get in touch with in two-way prayer. And this is what is honest and pure and unselfish and loving. That's how you know it. Because if it ain't any one of those things, if it's missing any one of those things, it cannot be the voice of God. So in 12, we receive our guidance, and then we go and we act on it. And this is where, if I have a chance to add one more absolute to the list, it would be courage. It would be courage, honesty, purity, unselfishness, love, and courage. Because it's going to take courage to do the work of recovery. It's going to take courage to become the self you are meant to be. It's going to take courage and discipline to come back each day in your two-way prayer and listen and sit and record and ask and do. It's going to take courage. I've met people along the way who had that courage. I wasn't real big with it when I certainly first started out, but I've stayed with it. I've been doing the practice now for 30 years. It's a life changer. So many of the changes in my life I can attribute very directly to that, and so I really encourage you to take it. This is not just like reading a lovely little meditation book. This is like opening your life to the hand of God, which exists inside each and every one of us and is pushing us and prompting us and pulling us towards becoming who we can be. So that's my little gig on the four absolutes and how they relate to two-way prayer. I think James Houck was absolutely right when he told me that. It took me a number of years to understand what he was talking about, but story of my life, I don't get it right away, but keep coming back, and it's going to make sense. It's going to make sense. Next week, I did finish that chapter, so I've got that in better order than I did this one. I know this one was a little bit messy, but Next week, we're going to look at the in-depth psychological change, the transformation process that happens in recovery, and how two-way prayer can be helpful with that. So hope this episode was helpful. If it was, love to hear from you. And again, if these podcasts are helpful to you, pass them on to other people who may be in need of hearing them. So thanks so much for listening. God bless, and keep coming back.